In this video, we're going to talk about how to debug PowerShell scripts in Visual Studio Code. We'll be using the Microsoft PowerShell Extension for Visual Studio Code, and we're kind of going to go through the basics up through some more advanced topics. We'll start with how to run your PowerShell scripts, how to set breakpoints, then we'll look at how to step through your PowerShell scripts. Then we'll talk about how to look at variables in the variable window, how to add watches for both variables and expressions, talk a little bit about what the call stack is. Then we'll look at how to use wait debugger to actually invoke the debugger. Next, we will execute commands from the terminal and break in the PowerShell debugger. Then we'll look at some advanced breakpoints, such as conditional breakpoints, hit count breakpoints, and log points. And then finally, we're going to configure some launch.json files to actually set up different configurations that you can use to launch in various ways inside Visual Studio. First, let's just look at the basics of executing PowerShell script in Visual Studio Code. So in my environment here, I'm running Visual Studio Code, and I have the PowerShell extension installed. So this is just the Microsoft PowerShell extension that you can get and install. So once that's installed, you're going to have things like IntelliSense and the ability to execute code. So in my environment, you can see in the top right side here, I actually have this run button that I can now click to execute this script. I'm getting a random value between 10 and 100, and then I'm just using write host to output that value. So clicking the run button will just run your script. You can also run your script by clicking F5 on the keyboard. So you can see again, it output a random value. Next, what you can actually do is you can set breakpoints just like you can in the ISE. So on the left hand side here, you're going to see there's this little gutter with the little breakpoint icon showing up. If I click that and now I press F5, it's going to break into the debugger. So the view kind of changes a little bit when this happens. You can see that the terminal has gone into debug mode. On the left hand side, the run and debug window has opened up. We have access to things like variables and the watch window and the call stack, and then a list of breakpoints at the bottom. If I were to press F5 or click continue, it's going to continue executing the script until it either hits another breakpoint or completes this section successfully. The other ways you can execute scripts inside Visual Studio Code are by using Control F5, and that will actually run the script without invoking the debugger. So even if I have a breakpoint set like this, if I hit Control F5, it's going to run my script and not hit the breakpoint. So you may want to do that occasionally, but leave all your breakpoints in there, and then if I just hit F5 again, it's going to hit the breakpoint. The other way to execute scripts is via the F8 or execute selection command. And when you execute selection, you actually will not hit breakpoints at all. So if I hit F8 here, you'll see it's executing my script, and it's not hitting my breakpoint that I have set in there. Now let's talk a little bit about stepping through your scripts. So once you set a breakpoint, you actually can take some actions inside the debugger when that breakpoint has been hit. So some things you can do is evaluate variables, kind of look at the state of your current PowerShell script, or you can start moving through your script as it executes. So stepping allows you to move line by line to see how each line is kind of changing the state of the PowerShell process and your script. So I have an invoke random function here that gets a random value between 10 and 100, and then it goes from 1 to that random value, and it outputs each value in between. I've set a breakpoint on line 8 where we're actually calling invoke random, and we're going to see how this behaves. So when I press F5, it hits my breakpoint, and again I have access to all these things like the watch window and variables and the call stack. But I also have access to this toolbar on the top right side here. So you can see I have options like continue, step over, step into, step out of, restart, and finally stop. So if I continue the script, it's just going to execute to completion. So for example, if I were to set a breakpoint somewhere else and then I hit F5, it's going to go to that next breakpoint. If I remove that breakpoint, it's just going to continue to the end. If I were to execute that again without that inner breakpoint and I press F5, it's just going to execute the script and no longer hit any breakpoints. Step over works by stepping over the current line that you're on. So if I press F5 and hit my breakpoint again, If I press F10, it's not going to step into the invoke random function. The idea with step over, step into, and step out of is that you're stepping either over the current line. Step into will step into that scope, and you'll see the call stack change. And step out will step out of the current scope and go back to the parent scope. So if I press F10 at this point, it's just going to step over everything pretty much because it didn't go into the invoke random function, and that's where all the contents of the script pretty much are. But if I press F5 again, hit the breakpoint, and press F11, now you can see that I've entered the invoke random function. So now if I start pressing F10, it's stepping through the lines inside this particular function. So you have to keep in mind the scopes that are going on here, because if I press F10 here, it stepped over the for each because we didn't step into that for each's scope, and then it exits out of the script. But if I were to press F11 and I continue to press F10 and then F11, you can see now I'm stepping into the for each block scope. So now that I'm in this scope, I could continue to press F10, and it's going to continue to go through each one of the items inside my for each block. If for some reason I wanted to leave this, I could either continue by pressing F5, or I could press the step out of button, which is Shift F11. So if I hit Shift F11, it steps out of my for each and back into my invoke random scope. And if I press F5, then that will go to completion. Obviously, there's two other options that we can select when debugging, that being restart, which will just literally restart the script, or we can stop debugging at this point in time and it won't execute the rest of the script. So that's kind of the idea with stepping, is that you can step through individual lines in your script and kind of step in and out of the different scopes as you go. One thing you may have noticed on the left-hand side as we were doing that process of stepping through our script was that the variables on the left-hand side were changing. So if we get back into our debugger by pressing F5, we can actually look at various states of the PowerShell process and the run space that we're running these scripts in. So you can see all the variables that are available to us. We have, you see all your built-in variables and that kind of thing. And as we step into our script, you'll see new variables are going to start being defined. It's going to start highlighting things that are changing. So you can see random has shown up, and now it's 62. And if we were to step into our for each, it's going to start highlighting things like $_, which shows the current iterator value for my for each, which is then being updated. The other thing that you can do is also watch variables and expressions. So let's say, for example, I had some variable in some other scope that I wanted to just kind of put in this watch window, or even my random variable, just to kind of make it look easier to see. I can put $random into the watch, and it's going to actually show me the value of that random. So what's cool about watches are they're actually just PowerShell expressions. So you could go, real crazy if you wanted to, and do something like get process ID, the ID of this process, and then the name. And if I hit enter there, it's actually going to evaluate that particular watch command every single time I step through my script. So it's going to keep, iterating and executing those commands. So the process is not going to change, but you might have something where you want to execute a command to see if the state of something is changing while that's happening. The other section here that you want to look at is actually the call stack. So the call stack pretty much shows how we got here from the start of the script. You can see that interactive session is the top level call stack, and that's kind of how Visual Studio Code started this. And then from there, we can actually click through these places and it'll show you how you got to where you are. So this script block was started on line 8 here, and that's what this little number is here. And then invoke random, we're inside invoke random on line 3, and now we're inside this script block on line 4. And I believe this is the column that it's starting on. So you can see in the bottom here, the line in column is 9, and that's what 4, 9 means. So we're on line 4, column 9. So the call stack kind of provides you history of how you got to the place that you are. And it's the same thing that's returned by get ps call stack. So now that we've looked at some of the basics of the debugging tools that you have available while you're debugging scripts, I want to show you some other ways to kind of get into the debugger, and then we'll talk about some additional ways to set breakpoints and hit points and log points. So I am going to stop my script now, and you can see that my run and debug has gone away. And what I'm actually going to do is just bring back more of a simple script just for purposes of this demonstration. And in the middle here, I'm going to put a wait debugger. Wait debugger is cool because it actually causes a script to break and wait for the debugger to attach to it. But the Visual Studio Code extension is like smart enough to pick up on the fact that that's happening. So even if I were to do Control F5, you're going to see that the wait debugger breakpoint gets hit. If you recall before, when I had breakpoints set, if I hit Control F5, it wouldn't hit the breakpoint. But with wait debugger, it will. So we'll let that go. And the other cool thing with wait debugger is if I actually took this script and like copy the path of that script and put it into my interactive console down here, and I hit that, you're going to see that wait debugger also executes there because it realizes this script is open inside Visual Studio and it hits my breakpoint for wait debugger. So that's kind of a cool way to execute things from the terminal. So now let's talk a little bit about different types of breakpoints you can actually add to break as well. So right there is a line breakpoint is what it's called when you actually just set a breakpoint on a line. Inside PowerShell, it's saying like inside test script.ps1, line 2, I want to hit a breakpoint. But there's other options that you can actually set for breakpoints. If you right click on this, you can say edit breakpoint. And then from there, you have three options. You have an expression, a hit count, and a log message. So an expression will break when it's true. So if our random value is less than, I don't know, 60, then our breakpoint will hit. And you can see the icon for the breakpoint changes a little bit, and if you hover over it, it gives you some information about what that condition is. So let's save that and hit F5. So that time it didn't break because you can see that the random value was 72, and my breakpoint said if it's under 60, then we should break. So let's see. There we go. So now it broke, and we can actually go look at our variable. I believe we want local. Where's random? I don't know, but I'm going to do random. And you can see random is 59. And because random is 59, that is why my breakpoint hit. So that's how you can use expression breakpoints, and you can put a bunch of stuff into your expression breakpoint. It's just a PowerShell command, and you can use the current state of your script to evaluate that expression. So it's a great way to set breakpoints on things that like hit a lot, and you don't want to like press F10 a bunch of times to your script. So another type of breakpoint we can hit is called a hit count breakpoint. So the hit count breakpoint is the idea that you just want to break after this breakpoint has been evaluated or has been run a certain amount of times. So like let's say we said 30. So you just want to put a number in there. So once this line has run 30 times, then we want to hit the breakpoint. So put that in there, and then if I were to do something like 1 to 100 and just do a for each on this right host line. Oh, and now my breakpoint moved, so I'm actually going to remove that and put that back here. We'll do hit count of 30. And now let's run our script. And now you can see the breakpoint hits. And what we can do to actually check to see what, how many times it's been hit is $_ since we're in a for each loop. And you can see $_ is 30. So we've hit this 30 times, and now my breakpoint triggers. So that's another good way to kind of evaluate the state of your script without having to press F10 a whole bunch of times. Like after 25 times my script stops working for some reason, you could put a hit count breakpoint in there. The last type of like special breakpoint that you can create in Visual Studio, at least through the UI, is what they call a log point. And the idea with a log point is it just outputs some text based on, or when it hits this particular line. So this is just a string, like a PowerShell string that you could type in here. So if I just did like random and I hit enter there, you can see it's a little triangle now instead or a little square instead of a circle. And then if we hit run, you can see random was output down in my terminal. That's because it hit that breakpoint or log point and output that to the console. So you could do the same thing with like, write host or write for post messages, but this is nice because this is like tweakable and it's just for your Visual Studio experience and not for inside your script itself. So let's edit this log point. The other thing that you can do is like, this is like an expandable string in PowerShell. So I could actually put in $random, and now when I run my log point, you can say it said random 15, and that's because it actually evaluated that variable. So just think of it kind of like an expandable string in PowerShell, and you can put those types of expressions inside your log point. All right, so now I want to look at a couple more advanced scenarios. So we're going to remove my log point, and we're actually going to go back to this run and debug section here. And you can see right now it's like wants you to customize a launch.json file. I think back in the early days of the PowerShell extension, you would have to configure this yourself just to get started. But we already have like this automatic configuration set up, and you no longer need to do that. But if you did want to set that up, this is where you would come. So when you're not debugging, if you go to run and debug, you can click this create a launch.json file. And what that's going to do is provide you some options that are kind of provided by the PowerShell extension. Launch current script, launch script, interactive session, or attach the debugger to a running PowerShell host. So by default, it's pretty much the launch and debug the currently active window. But if you wanted to, you could do something like launch script. So it generates the launch.json script for you here. And what's nice about this is there's IntelliSense. So you don't have to like totally like figure this out all by yourself. If you actually start typing, it's going to provide you with some information. Some of it's straightforward, some of it you might need to look up. But in this case, we're just doing a launch request, and it's pretty much saying like, I want to use the current folder, and then I want to launch something, for this script, like not the current script, but some script in my environment. So it doesn't matter where I am. If I press F5, this is what I want to happen. So I have this other script in here. It does nothing cool except start process and wait debugger. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to launch that script here. So I'll just do script.ps1 inside my launch config. And then you can see here we have the run and debug launch script here. I could also like update the name, like launch script.ps1. And that'll actually update the name that you see in there. So now when I press F5, it doesn't matter where I am, it's going to run that script. And you'll notice a couple things that happened. I saw my notepad start up, and it also broke in the debugger. So it was smart enough to actually hit that wait debugger call, and now the Visual Studio Code debugger is attached to that script, and we could like go ahead and do all the evaluating that we want to for our script.ps1. The other really handy one is attaching to another process. So we actually have this attached to PowerShell host process, and this by default will attach to the current process. And if you have a background run space that you want to attach to, you could put that run space ID in here. So it's a little tricky because the run space IDs change all the time, so you'd have to like update your launch.json file all the time, but I'll show you kind of an easier way to do that in a sec. So now we could say, attach to a process. I want to attach to the process ID that I'm going to specify here, and I'm going to open another PowerShell process. So we have this additional PowerShell process running here. The ID of this process is 21592. We can copy that, put that into our process ID, and now when we do attach to process or attach to host process, it's going to actually attach to that PowerShell process. And you can see the debugger now is like waiting inside here, and it's not super interesting because nothing's really going on. But if we were to take, for example, this script, and I am going to copy the path to that script, and then I'm going to do start red job and run that script, you can see it started Notepad, so the script is running. And if I do get run space on this, you'll see that this script is in Breakpoint. So that's because I have that wait debugger call in there. And you can see the run space ID is 3. So if I come back here, I can change this run space ID to 3 and save that. And now when I come in here and I do attach to host process, you can see that it broke into this other process. So if you look down here, you can see that the process ID is actually this other PowerShell process. So it's pretty much a remote debugging scenario where I've attached to this other place, and I'm in run space 3. I can see that the PID here is not the current process ID of this local terminal. It's actually the process ID of that remote process, which means that I can like debug, other PowerShell processes on my machine. So now, if I were to just continue that, and we do get run space over here again, you can see that run space 3 is no longer here, and that's because we actually use that wait debugger and it let the script continue after I disconnected from that, that session. This remote host is actually Visual Studio Code connecting to this PowerShell process. So that's just what happens when you connect to a PowerShell process like that. And now I can hit Control-C and exit the debugger, and if we check the PID again, you'll see that I'm back in my, my local PowerShell process. Another way you can do this is we actually have some tools in Visual Studio, or PowerShell Pro Tools, where if you do start thread job, again, it's going to start a background process. Remember that this PID is 21,592. And if you actually click, I don't know why this icon is a watch right now, but if you click that, and we actually go to host processes, and we'll just refresh this. And you can see that we have process ID 21,592. And if I expand that, you're going to see that the run spaces actually show up, and you'll be able to connect to those with this little debugger icon, and it's doing all the same commands as Visual Studio Code does, but you don't need to modify the launch.json file. You can just do those directly from this little helper window here, and then connect to the PowerShell process that way and start debugging just with a couple clicks. So in this video, we went through all the various ways that you can debug PowerShell scripts in Visual Studio Code.